The room sat above the street like a held breath, oil lamps trembling while boots echoed somewhere below, and it was there, away from the crowds, away from rehearsed prayers, that the teacher called only 3 people forward. Not the circle everyone remembered, not the names carved into memory by repetition, but the quieter witnesses who had already learned how to see without asking for permission. Their names were different now. Kepha became Raman, Yaakov became Elier, Yohanan became Sahir, because what happened in that room was never meant to fossilize into biography. It was meant to stay alive. No speeches were given. No doctrine was explained. The teacher understood something institutions never forgive: words decay faster than practice. So instead, he placed objects into their hands, simple things, common enough to escape suspicion, while explaining, almost casually, that these were not symbols. They were tools. Tools that interfered with the invisible order running the world like clockwork. Tools that made the watchers uncomfortable. Tools that worked whether anyone approved or not. Outside, the city hummed with its usual certainty. Inside, certainty was dissolving. The first object felt warm, though no flame touched it. The second felt coarse and grounding. The third carried weight disproportionate to its size. None of them looked dangerous. That was the point. Power that announces itself is easy to contain, power that hides in the ordinary slips through cracks. The teacher watched their faces carefully, not for belief, but for recognition. Recognition meant the spark was already awake enough to use what was being given. He didn't warn them about enemies. He didn't name the forces that would recoil from these tools. He only said this: there are systems that depend on you forgetting who you are, and there are limits to how those systems can reach you. Fear is their access point. Fragmentation is their method. Forgetting is their favorite trick. These objects interrupt all 3. Raman asked why the others weren't there. The teacher smiled, not unkindly. Some truths can be shared. Some have to be carried. If you hand everyone a key before they know there is a door, most will lose it, trade it, or try to worship it instead. Better to let a few learn how it works first. What followed wasn't ritual in the theatrical sense. No chanting, no hierarchy. Just instruction layered into conversation, so it could be remembered without sounding like command. The teacher explained that the world operates like a managed enclosure. Not evil in a cartoon sense, efficient, regulated, emotionally draining. A place where attention is harvested and recycled. Within that enclosure, there are administrators, not monsters, whose influence depends entirely on predictable human states: fear, urgency, self-doubt, isolation. When those states disappear, so does their leverage. That is why the tools were physical. Abstract truth excites the mind. Physical action reprograms the field around the body. The watchers can argue philosophy all day, they cannot cross certain thresholds. They cannot tolerate coherence. They cannot attach to someone who remembers themselves while fully embodied. The teacher made it clear that nothing about these objects worked automatically. Left untouched, they were inert. Used unconsciously, they were decorative. What activated them was alignment, the inner decision to stop outsourcing authority. When intention and matter met, something changed in the surrounding field. Not metaphorically. Functionally. He also made something else clear, almost as an aside: none of this required permission. Not from a temple. Not from a lineage. Not from history. Authority was not granted from above, it was recognized from within. That, more than anything, was why the knowledge would later be buried, softened, renamed, and redistributed as ceremony instead of instruction. Sahir noticed the stillness that had settled into the room. The noise outside felt distant now, as if muffled by a layer of glass. The teacher nodded. This is what happens when attention stops leaking. This is the baseline state they don't want you returning to. Remember how this feels. Before they parted, the teacher told them something that would only make sense later: use these quietly. Not to prove anything. Not to convert anyone. Use them when you feel drained for no reason. When sleep becomes heavy and unrestful. When the world feels louder than your own thoughts. These moments are not accidents, they are maintenance cycles of the system. Interrupt them. Then he added, almost playfully, that the simplest tools are always the most threatening, because they leave no one to blame when they work. The lamps were extinguished. The objects were hidden under cloaks that would later be searched without result. By morning, nothing in the city looked different. And yet, something irreversible had been set in motion, not a rebellion, not a religion, but a quiet redistribution of access. That night would never make it into official memory. Councils would argue about meanings. Texts would be filtered. Names would be polished. But the tools themselves would persist, disguised as tradition, stripped of explanation, waiting for people who could feel their function without being told why. If any part of this feels familiar rather than new, that isn't coincidence. Recognition always precedes understanding. And understanding always comes later, when the system is no longer listening. Once you understand the room, the city outside starts to make sense in a different way. Not as chaos, not as moral failure, but as design. A place calibrated to keep attention fractured and energy leaking. The teacher never called it evil. He called it efficient. Efficient systems don't need hatred, they only need repetition. And repetition works best when people forget there is an alternative state to return to. The ancient texts describe this enclosure as layered, regulated, and patrolled, not by horned demons, but by functionaries. Administrators. Enforcers of pattern. They don't create suffering directly, they manage conditions that produce it automatically. Fear loops. Desire cycles. Identity confusion. Emotional exhaustion. None of this is personal. It's logistical. Above the system sits what the old writers called the false architect, not a villain in the theatrical sense, but a being obsessed with order and control, convinced that limitation itself is sacred. Beneath it operate the watchers, whose role is to keep the sparks, human consciousness fragments, circulating without remembering their origin. Memory, not morality, is the threat. Here's the part most people miss: these watchers do not have free access to you. They cannot override your will. They cannot enter coherence. They can only amplify what already resonates with them. Fear invites them. Fragmentation feeds them. Doubt gives them permission. When those conditions disappear, their influence collapses. This is why the teacher didn't preach courage. Courage can still vibrate with fear. He taught coherence. Unity within the self. When thought, emotion, body, and intention align, there is nothing for the system to grab onto. You become boring to it. Invisible. That invisibility isn't mystical in the poetic sense. It's functional. Like stepping outside the bandwidth of a signal. You don't fight the transmission, you leave its range. This is where the three objects begin to make technical sense. The first, the oil, was never about obedience. Oil carries intention exceptionally well. Its molecular structure holds and distributes subtle charge. When applied consciously, it marks boundaries between internal authority and external interference. The old texts didn't say it blessed someone. They said it sealed them. Seals are not symbolic. They define access. The forehead, heart center, and hands weren't chosen randomly. The forehead governs narrative, what you believe is happening. The heart regulates coherence, how fragmented or unified you feel. The hands are exchange points, where energy leaves and enters through action. When those points are sealed with intention, interference loses traction. The watchers rely on insertion, thoughts that aren't yours, emotions that don't match your circumstances, fatigue that arrives without cause. Seals disrupt insertion. The second object, salt, operates differently. Salt doesn't seal, it clarifies. Its crystalline structure creates order. In the physical body, salt governs electrical balance. In the subtle field, it establishes thresholds. The old communities used salt the way modern systems use firewalls. You don't argue with what's outside the boundary. You define where the boundary is. This is why salt appears at doorways, beds, meals. Not superstition, architecture. Sleep is when coherence loosens. Attention drifts. That's when influence is easiest. Salt stabilizes the field during those transitions. Internally, when consumed with intention, it raises baseline frequency. Not through belief, but through embodied signal. The watchers cannot attach to stability. They require emotional decay, an energetic equivalent of rot. Salt interrupts decay. Preservation is its nature. The third object, bread, is the most misunderstood, because it addresses the system's primary strategy, isolation. Fragmentation keeps sparks manageable. Isolated units are predictable. Unified fields are not. The shared meal wasn't remembrance. It was synchronization. Eating the same substance with shared intention brings bodies into resonance. Even alone, conscious consumption unifies the internal fragments, the thinking self, the feeling self, the sensing self, into coherence. That coherence produces a field effect. The watchers don't attack unified fields because they can't insert difference into something already whole. This is why modern food is designed the way it is. Stripped, processed, disconnected from intention. Consumption becomes mechanical instead of conscious. Frequency drops. Fragmentation increases. Control becomes effortless. The teacher understood all of this without turning it into ideology. He knew explanation wasn't the goal. Application was. Which is why he warned them, institutions would keep the forms and remove the function. They would keep oil but turn it into permission-based ritual. Keep salt but hide its purpose. Keep bread but externalize authority. Power would be relocated upward, away from the individual spark. And it worked. For centuries. People learned to ask instead of act. To believe instead of align. To outsource what had been placed directly in their hands. But systems built on forgetting always leak. Texts get buried instead of destroyed. Practices get diluted instead of erased. Memory survives in fragments, waiting for the moment when recognition returns before explanation. If you're listening to this and feeling an unusual calm instead of excitement, that's a sign you're already aligning. Excitement spikes and crashes. Recognition settles. What matters now is not belief. Belief is still external. What matters is preparation. Understanding the mechanics without dramatizing them. The watchers are not impressed by rebellion. They are confused by neutrality. In the next part, everything turns practical. Not theory. Not myth. Exact activation. Words, timing, placement. Nothing theatrical. Nothing that requires an audience. Just the kind of quiet action that never makes headlines and always changes outcomes. Stay with that stillness you're feeling. That's the state these tools respond to. And once you know how to use them deliberately, the system loses its favorite advantage, your unawareness. By the time the instructions were finally spoken out loud, the teacher made one thing clear: nothing here works if rushed. Speed belongs to the system. Precision belongs to you. These tools respond to state, not urgency. If you treat them like superstition, they remain inert. If you treat them like authority, they activate. Start with the oil. Not because it is strongest but because it establishes orientation. Pure oil, unblended, unperfumed, held in your hands long enough for your attention to settle. You don't need emotion. Emotion fluctuates. You need recognition. Recognition is quiet. When you speak, speak slowly, not theatrically. You are not persuading the universe, you are declaring alignment within yourself. When the oil touches the center of the forehead, you are not asking for protection. You are withdrawing consent from intrusive narrative. This point governs interpretation, what stories automatically run in your mind. Sealing it doesn't silence thought, it restores authorship. When the oil touches the chest, you are stabilizing coherence. This is not sentiment. The heart's electromagnetic field synchronizes the body. Coherence here determines whether you feel whole or scattered. When the oil touches the palms, you are regulating exchange. What you give carries less depletion. What you receive carries less distortion. Do not repeat the action obsessively. Once is enough. Repetition without awareness degrades signal. Salt comes next, because boundaries only work once orientation is established. Natural salt, crystalline, held briefly, no ceremony. The words you speak matter only because they align intention. You are not commanding the salt, you are informing your own field what the boundary is. Place it where you rest. Corners define space. This is geometry, not magic. When you taste the salt, do not rush it. Let it dissolve. Salt interacts with your body's electrical balance immediately. This is why the effect feels physical, not imagined. The system cannot attach to clarity. Confusion is its interface. Salt disrupts confusion. Bread comes last, because unity is the result, not the entry point. This is where most traditions inverted the process. Unity cannot be commanded, it emerges. When you hold the bread, you are not reenacting a memory. You are synchronizing internal fragments. Eat slowly. Not reverently, presently. Presence is the operative condition. As you eat, notice whether your breathing deepens without effort. That's coherence returning. Notice whether internal commentary softens. That's fragmentation dissolving. The watchers depend on internal noise. Silence is not emptiness, it is inaccessibility. There is one thing you must understand before you do any of this. Resistance will appear. Not dramatic resistance, subtle. A thought telling you it's unnecessary. Another suggesting you do it later. Another mocking the simplicity. These thoughts are not random. They are pattern defense. Efficient systems resist interruption automatically. Do not fight the resistance. Fighting feeds it. Acknowledge it, then proceed anyway. Action collapses interference faster than argument. If you do this correctly, the effect will not be explosive. It will be stabilizing. You may sleep more deeply. You may feel less reactive the next day. Situations that once drained you may feel oddly neutral. This is not transcendence. It is baseline restoration. The teacher never promised escape overnight. He promised access. Access changes trajectory quietly. Over time, coherence compounds. Fragmentation loses ground. Influence fades not because it is defeated, but because it is no longer relevant. That was always the strategy. Not rebellion. Not confrontation. Irrelevance. Use the tools when needed, not compulsively. They are not badges. They are interfaces. And the more naturally you integrate them, the less noticeable they become, to you and to anything watching. That is how freedom works in systems built on surveillance. You don't announce it. You embody it until there is nothing left to monitor. If you've stayed with this to the end, notice how you feel right now. Not emotionally, physically. Quieter doesn't mean weaker. It means less occupied. That state is the real takeaway. Everything else was instruction layered on top of recognition that was already happening. None of this asks you to reject traditions, argue theology, or adopt a new identity. Those are distractions. What matters is whether you reclaim authorship over your own state. Systems persist because people forget they have that option. Remembering doesn't look dramatic. It looks calm. It looks grounded. It looks like fewer hooks. If you decide to try what was described, do it privately. Don't perform it. Don't announce it. Let results speak in the only language that matters, your lived experience. Pay attention to what changes and, just as importantly, to what stops happening. If this resonated, share it with someone who doesn't respond well to hype but understands quiet precision. That's who this reaches best. If you want more conversations like this, less noise, more clarity, consider subscribing. It helps this kind of material surface where it otherwise wouldn't. If you found value here, a simple like tells the system this content deserves oxygen. And if you feel moved to comment, don't explain, just acknowledge. Recognition is enough. You don't need to believe anything you heard. You only need to notice what happens when you act with coherence instead of habit. That's where authority has always lived.